the recording. All right, so what we did last time, the last recording, went as far as the basal nuclei. We went over the white matter and the gray matter of the brain, actually the white matter of the brain, which is called tracts. And let me just go ahead and review that really, really quick because it's actually easy. The tracts that connected parts of the brain within the same hemisphere were called association fibers, and this one's in red will be association fibers. So, for example, the tracts that connect the Wernicke's language area, and the Broca's language area, both on the left hemisphere, will be an association fibers. The fibers that connected right and left hemispheres, right here, like the corpus callosum, are called commissural fibers, and then the fibers that connect the cerebrum with other parts of the brain are called projection fibers. So you should be able to distinguish the different types of fibers. Then we talked about another area of gray matter in the cerebrum. We had been talking about the cerebral cortex and the different functions of the cerebral cortex. Other areas of gray matter are found in nuclei, and the basal nuclei, also called basal ganglia. And I have it here because you will hear it called ganglia on some textbooks. However, I don't want to confuse the ganglia with the ganglia of the PNS, and that's why I don't like to use the word ganglia for the gray matter of the central nervous system of the brain specifically. I like to just use the word nuclei instead. So the basal nuclei is a group of nuclei of clusters of bodies of neurons that have a function in skeletal muscle movement, especially in complex planned kinds of movements. You should know the names of the areas that the basal nuclei encompasses, and in the cerebrum, the basal nuclei includes the caudaty nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, which in turn is made by the putamen and the globus pallidus. So you can see here the putamen, the globus pallidus, and here is the caudaty nucleus. This is all in the cerebrum, and it's all part of the basal nuclei. Also part of the basal nuclei is the subthalamic nucleus, meaning the hypothalamus, parts of the subthalamic nuclei. And then in the midbrain, this one is important, in the substantia nigra, which is going to be the area that is going to secrete the neurotransmitter dopamine, which will be, these neurons are going to go up to the basal nuclei in the cerebrum and deliver dopamine to the neurons of the caudaty nucleus and the lentiform nuclei. So these are the important areas of the basal nuclei that you need to know. You also would need to know the function of the basal nuclei, which is to influence skeletal muscle control, is also involved in attention and cognition, regulates the intensity of slow or stereotyped movements. And intensity is an important word because what that means is that when there is a malfunction of the basal nuclei, the intensity of a movement cannot be controlled. It is also important at inhibiting antagonistic and unnecessary movements. And this is probably one of the first signs and symptoms of basal nuclear dysfunction as it occurs during Parkinson's disease. So you should have an idea of what the functions of the basal nuclei are and what are the structures that are found in the basal nuclei, that are part of the basal nuclei. We also looked at the diencephalon, and if you remember, the diencephalon is made by three portions: the epithalamus on top, thalamus in the middle, hypothalamus at the bottom of below the thalamus. And the thalamus is an area, right here is this purple area right there. It is described as the final relay station for sensory information. So it comprises most of the diencephalon, and it is the last place where sensory neurons are going to synapse. So there's typically three sensory neurons that bring sensory information to the cerebrum, to the cerebral cortex. And the final synapse between neuron number 2 and neuron number 3 will take place in the thalamus. It's also involved in mediating motor activities between the motor cortex areas, like the primary motor cortex, for example, and the basal nuclei, which is located in a different area of the cerebrum. Also, the base part of the basal nuclei will be parts of the mesencephalon, which are below the cerebrum. So for information to go from the mesencephalon to the motor areas above, the neurons have to go through the thalamus. So the thalamus is a mediator for these neurons. So that's why it's called the final relay station. In this picture right here, they're giving you the depiction of the different nuclei or clusters of bodies of neurons within the thalamus, each with a different function. The only one to worry about are these medial geniculate nucleus, which is in charge of receiving auditory information and then relaying the auditory information from here to the auditory cortex in the cerebrum. The lateral geniculate nucleus or body is in charge of receiving visual information, and so that again will be the area where the last relay will happen between neuron number 2. Neuron number 3 receives that information and takes it to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Okay, now we move on to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is an area of gray matter. It has numerous nuclei, as you can see here. Each one of these color areas is a cluster of bodies of neurons, each one with a different function. We are going to talk about one of these areas, which kind of protrudes from the outside into the outside of the hypothalamus. It's called the mammillary body. And the mammillary body is in charge of putting together reflex movements that are associated with eating, licking, suckling, things that have to do with the mouth. Okay. So that's where those reflexes are coming from. They're coming from the mammillary body of the hypothalamus. You do need to know other functions of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in direct connection to the pituitary. As you can see here, this little stalk right there called the infundibulum directly connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland below. The pituitary gland in turn secretes hormones, and so that the hypothalamus will influence the hormones secreted by the pituitary. The hypothalamus is the center for autonomic control. That is incredibly important. This is the, sorry about that. This is the autonomic control center. Okay, so the autonomic control center, what that means is that this is the center where sympathetic and parasympathetic function is controlled. This area controls blood pressure, heart rate, digestive tract motility, vascular constriction or dilation, and a host of other autonomic functions via the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So this is the control center for sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. Very, very important. The hypothalamus is also part of the limbic system, so it is involved in emotional responses. Perception of pleasure, fear, rage, some biological rhythms and drives arise in the hypothalamus also. The hypothalamus regulates body temperature. As a matter of fact, this is the place where the thermostat of the body is located, is in the hypothalamus. Regulates water balance through the action of hormones and thirst, center for thirst. Again, regulates the sleep-awake cycles. Now, this is also important. Controls the release of hormones by the anterior pituitary and produces the hormones secreted by the posterior pituitary. And the reason why this is so important is because the pituitary gland is considered the master gland, which controls other glands in the body. However, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. So it is, if you will, the master of the master. So that tells you how important the hypothalamus is controlling autonomic function via hormones and via the autonomic nervous system. So really all control of body function, the function of organs, has its center in the hypothalamus. We control organ systems via the autonomic nervous system and through hormones. And the hypothalamus is the center for control of both the autonomic nervous system and the release of hormones that in turn control the master gland. So ultimately, the hypothalamus is the center for all of this control. So it is, needless to say, a very, very important area. In this PowerPoint, I give you every one of the nuclei and the functions of each of the nuclei. No, you don't have to know the names of nuclei. You do need to know the functions. So involving the sleep-awake cycles. You need to know the endocrine functions of the hypothalamus. And there's two. The hypothalamus secretes the hormones that are going to control the anterior pituitary, and they secrete the hormones that are going to be secreted by the posterior pituitary. So there's two groups of hormones that the hypothalamus is going to be in charge of secreting. Center for control of body temperature, sexual drives, thirst, hunger, emotions, what else? Yeah, again, water intake control, again, emotions in a lot of places here. Okay, so you get an idea of what the hypothalamus is in charge of, so you can see how important it is. So the hypothalamus controls, regulates. It does not regulate somatic motor movement because somatic motor means skeletal muscle, and that is voluntary. The hypothalamus is in charge of autonomic function, which is smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and is involuntary. It is in charge of controlling endocrine, regulating endocrine glands, heartbeat, and not consciousness, that's somewhere else, sleep-awake cycles. Okay. Epithalamus. The epithalamus, there's really one function that we care about, and it is the place where the pineal gland is located. And the pineal gland secretes a hormone called melatonin. Function of melatonin is a little bit obscured in humans. It does regulate sleep-awake cycles, just like the hypothalamus does. It is also involved in the onset of puberty. So you should know where the pineal gland is located and that it secretes melatonin. So melatonin is a hormone secreted by the pineal gland, involved in sleep-awake cycles, circadian rhythms, and involved is an important factor on the onset of puberty. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next region. So we're working our way down on the brain. And let's see if I have a picture. Okay, there we go. So right here, we just finished going through the diencephalon. On the previous PowerPoints, we went over the cerebral cortex and the basal nuclei and the limbic system, which are all part of the cerebrum. We just got through going through the diencephalon, which is made of the epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. The next portion we're going to go over is this little bitty portion right here called the mesencephalon or midbrain. So let's go over the functions of the mesencephalon or midbrain. The mesencephalon or midbrain are part of the brainstem. Remember from previous PowerPoints, the brainstem consists of three regions: midbrain or mesencephalon. You should remember it has two names: the pons and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain has several structures that are important to remember. We're going to look at it from the anterior view first. And on the anterior view, there are two very pronounced cerebral peduncles. And the cerebral peduncles are essentially routes through which axons of neurons are traveling, specifically the axons of the pyramidal neurons, which had their origin in the primary motor cortex of the cerebral cortex. So these are called the pyramidal motor tracts, which are part of the cortical spinal tract. It's called cortical because these axons of neurons begin at the motor cortex, and they're going to be continuous. There's going to be one long series of axons that are going to end at the spinal cord. And at the spinal cord, the axons are going to synapse and give the command to the next set of neurons, which are going to take the command out of the spinal cord towards the skeletal muscle. So these are very long tracks called the pyramidal motor tracts, which are going to travel through the cerebral peduncles. And because these are somatic motor neurons means these are neurons that are going to serve a skeletal muscle. Remember from a previous chapter, chapter 11, that somatic motor neurons were group A neurons that were huge neurons, huge axons with heavy myelination. So they're so big that they create these visible large tracks as they travel through the mesencephalon. That is what we call the cerebral peduncles. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Middle cerebellar. Those are the cerebellar peduncles. Cerebral peduncles. They are okay. There we go. Cerebral peduncles in the midbrain, right there. Okay, so this area right here and right here. And again, we're looking at an anterior view. Okay, so you need to remember where these are located. Another feature of the midbrain is the cerebral aqueduct, and this one is posterior and is actually better seen from a sagittal view. So if you look at a sagittal view of the brain, you can see the mesencephalon right there. So this area right here is the mesencephalon. And within the mesencephalon, on the posterior aspect, you can see these little passageway right there, which is the cerebral aqueduct that is connecting the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So the cerebral aqueduct is part of the midbrain or mesencephalon. So we have cerebral peduncles, the cerebral aqueduct. Another structure found in the midbrain or mesencephalon is called the corpora quadrigemina, and that's important. This is an important feature. Corpora quadrigemina. Quadri means four. Gemina means twins. So these are the four twins. Two twins are called the superior colliculi. The other two are called the inferior colliculi. Let me show you the location. This is a posterior or dorsal view of the midbrain right here. And you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4 nuclei, which are called the corpora quadrigemina. These are nuclei, which means these are bodies of neurons that are synapsing with axons that arrive and axons that leave. So this nuclei is going to create reflex movements of the eye, visual reflexes, and auditory reflexes. So this is the superior collicula is visual and auditory reflex center. Inferior collicula is an auditory relay center. So what are visual and auditory reflexes? Visual reflexes. If somebody shines a bright light on your eyes, two things are going to happen. Your pupils will constrict and your neck muscles will contract and you will move your head away from the source of bright light. Both are reflexes. Both are put together by the superior colliculi. An auditory reflex. If somebody calls your name, your reflex is to move towards where the direction of the sound. If there is a loud, sudden sound, your reflex to move towards the place where the sound came from. That's a reflex, and it's an auditory reflex put together by the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. So again, you should be able to identify the two superior colliculi and the two inferior colliculi, which all four of them together make up the corpora quadrigemina located in the midbrain. So we have the cerebral peduncles, the aqueduct, the cerebral aqueduct, the corpora quadrigemina with the superior and inferior colliculi, and then the last structure in the midbrain that we need to know is called the substantia nigra. And this is a nuclei, meaning this is going to be bodies of neurons, and these are part of the basal nuclei. So these are the neurons that secrete dopamine. These little neurons are going to, their axons are going to travel from the substantia nigra all the way up to through the thalamus into the basal nuclei of the cerebrum and release dopamine on the basal nuclei of the cerebrum, the lentiform nuclei and the caudati nuclei. So this is the area where dopamine is being secreted. The neurons that secrete dopamine are leaving from the substantia nigra. So you should know that that's also part of the midbrain. Okay, so that makes us move on. We're through with the midbrain. Now we're going to move on to this large here, which is called the pons. The pons have respiratory centers, we call them pontine respiratory centers. Is also the place where several of the cranial nerves originate, specifically cranial nerve number 5, number 6, and number 7. The pons is also a relay center between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain. So this is the pons right here. It is located right in front of the cerebellum. So any information that needs to go into the cerebellum, it will go to the pons first. Any information that needs to get out of the cerebellum will go through the pons first. So it is kind of like the gatekeeper for the cerebellum. It's also part of the anterior wall of the fourth ventricle. It is a passageway for fibers, which means axons, that connect higher parts of the brain and relays impulses between motor cortex of the cerebrum and other places below. Okay, so you should know the functions of the pons. The last part of the brain stem is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata has several important features. It has the inferior olivary nuclei, which relays sensory information from muscles and joints to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is in charge of a lot of somatic motor movement. The medulla oblongata is also in charge of some autonomic reflex centers. So this is not like the hypothalamus that controls. This is more of a reflex response. So information comes into the medulla and a reflex, a command goes out. Information that comes into the medulla is all within normal range, is all part of homeostasis. So the medulla is going to be informed of normal within homeostatic changes of blood pressure, heart rate, vascular vasoconstriction or dilation. And based on the information received, the autonomic reflexes, autonomic centers in the medulla are going to adjust in order to keep the body in homeostasis. So there is going to be a cardiovascular center in the medulla, cardiac center, and a vasomotor center, which is going to adjust blood vessel diameter in order to regulate blood pressure. So a lot of this has to do with blood pressure regulation. Keep in mind that throughout the day, due to the activities, and different levels of hydration, or blood pressure could go a little bit up, a little bit low. The medulla is in charge through this autonomic cardiovascular center to make sure that we don't go out of homeostasis or blood pressure changes up and down. Okay. Also in the medulla, we have a respiratory center. Actually, the main respiratory center that is going to create the rhythm of respiration is found in the medulla. So everyday breathing has its root in the medulla. There's also other centers. I'll let you read about them. The important ones, cardiovascular centers and respiratory centers. Okay. Finally, the last part of the brain is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is it is located posterior to the pons and the medulla, posterior and inferior to the cerebrum. The cerebellum, the best way that I have to describe the cerebellum is when you think of the cerebellum, think of a gymnast. A gymnast would have, or any athlete for that matter, will have a very well-developed cerebellum. It provides subconscious timing and patterns of a skeletal muscle contraction. So we're going to be talking about autonomic skeletal voluntary skeletal muscle. So when a gymnast or a dancer performs the movements, those movements have been learned through constant repetition, and eventually through constant repetition the cerebellum learns the movements. And once the cerebellum learns the movements can be performed in a perfect seamless manner. As long as the motor cortex of the cerebrum is the only one in charge, or as long as it is the main one in charge of the skeletal muscle movements, the movement is not perfect. It is not until the cerebellum takes over and finally learns it that we can perform the seamless type of apparently perfect movement. But that requires practice and repetition. So that's what the cerebellum is in charge of. It receives sensory information from most sensory centers, as we're going to see here in just a second. So the cerebellum has two hemispheres. The middle area is called the vermis. It is folded just like the cerebrum is, and the folds are called folia. The superficial area is gray matter. The center is white matter, which is called the arbor vitae. The cerebellum receives information from the motor cortex of the cerebrum. And so when we initiate a muscle contraction, or when we plan a muscle contraction, that information will be sent to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum will perform that set of movements in a seamless manner. Think about how a toddler walks. A toddler is just beginning to walk. It is the motor cortex of the cerebrum walking, and compare that to how we walk when the cerebellum has taken over. At that point, we don't have to think about it. We just do it. As a matter of fact, if we think about it, that means our cerebral cortex, motor cortex, is taking over, and then we don't walk as graciously or gracefully as we normally do when we try to think about it. So this is an autonomic movement that we have learned once the cerebellum has taken over. So in order to do that, the cerebellum needs information from the senses. It needs information from general senses and special senses. So visual information is going to be sent to the cerebellum. Equilibrium information will be sent to the cerebellum. Proprioceptor information from muscles and joints will be sent to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum needs all this information in order to put together movements. So that's essentially in a nutshell what the cerebellum does. You can see here the white matter of the cerebellum, which is called the arbor vitae. You can see the folds, which are called folia. Okay. And then the last part of the brain we're going to talk about is the RAS, or a reticular activation system, which is an area that receives sensory information, and it takes that information and sends it to the cerebral cortex to keep it keep us consciously alert. Now, let me show you here. Okay, so this is in blue, the ascending general sensory tracts. This is information about touch, pain, temperature, just to mention a few, which is coming up towards the brainstem, towards the thalamus, which is the final relay station. From the thalamus, the information is given to the last neuron, neuron number 3, which will relay it to the appropriate area in the cerebellum, in the cerebral cortex. Also, visual impulses and auditory impulses arrive at the thalamus, and they are relayed towards the appropriate lobe of the brain, which in this case will be the occipital lobe in the case of visual information. Same thing for auditory impulses coming in. Okay. So that's what we call the reticular formation. It's this pathway of sensory information that goes up through the brainstem, taking all this information to the thalamus, and the thalamus is going to take that information and relay it to the appropriate part of the cerebellum. Keep in mind that most of the information received will not go forward. So 99% of all stimuli is filtered out because it's repetitive or weak stimuli. And the thalamus is not going to send it to the cerebral cortex. This influx of information through the brainstem is what keeps us alert and awake. So when we first wake up in the morning, this flood of information begins to come in through the brainstem and activates the RAS, the reticular association system. It wakes us up, and from that point on, we're going to keep alert until we go to sleep again via this constant influx of sensory information. So that's what the RAS is. Okay, so dopamine is secreted by the substantia nigra of the mesencephalon and is sent to the basal nuclei of the cerebrum. Cardiovascular centers are found in the medulla oblongata. Visual cortex and association areas are in the occipital lobe. The frontal lobe has no sensory areas. Parietal lobe has somatic sensory areas for general senses. The lobe had the auditory and the auditory centers and the olfactory centers. And the olfactory centers were also located in the limbic system. Okay, I guess that's it. Yep, all right. So what I'm going to do next, if there are no questions, I can move on. Okay, so if there are no questions, I'm going to move on to the next PowerPoint, which deals with cranial nerves. Okay, so cranial nerves are incredibly important. They're just not going to go away. They're going to come back next semester, and they're going to follow you throughout your clinical career. Cranial nerves are called cranial because they come in and out of the brain. If the nerve is bringing in sensory information from the PNS to the CNS, we're going to call this cranial nerve sensory. If the information is going out of the CNS towards the PNS in the form of motor commands, going to whatever effector in the PNS is going to receive the commands, like cardiac muscle or a smooth muscle, we're going to call these nerves motor nerves. Some nerves have both. They have sensory information coming in, and they have motor commands going out, all within the same nerve. So they have some axons that are bringing sensory information, some axons that are taking motor commands. We call those mixed nerves. They have a mixture of sensory and motor. We're going to go through the 12 pairs of nerves associated with the brain, and we're going to point out which ones are sensory, which ones are motor, which ones are mixed. Okay. Each nerve is identified by a number and by a name, and you need to know both, the number and the name. The number is typically written in Roman numerals. So if you don't want to write them in Roman numerals, it's okay to write them in regular arithmetic numbers. But Roman numerals, you still have to learn how to read them, just because they're typically written in Roman numeral numbers. Okay. There are many mnemonic devices that can help you remember the names, and I'll let you figure out which one works for you. So we're going to refer to this PowerPoint, to this over and over again as we go through the nerves, and we come back and point out where this nerve is originating in the brain. This is a nice chart that goes over each of the cranial nerves, their number, whether they are, let's see, so it has the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, whether the function is sensory or motor, and whether the nerve is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, keep in mind, parasympathetic is part of the visceral motor division of the PNS. So this is going to be a motor nerve, or the motor function of the nerve, of the cranial nerve. So there are 4 cranial nerves which are part of the parasympathetic nervous system, and all of it will be the motor function that we're talking about. Parasympathetic refers to motor function. Okay. All right, so we're going to start with cranial nerve number 1, which is the olfactory nerve. As the name implies, the olfactory nerve is bringing in olfaction or olfactory information from the nose. Olfaction means smell. So here are the fibers that are picking up olfactory information from the nasal cavity, and these little fibers are going to go to this area. They're going to go from the nasal cavity to the olfactory foramina of the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, into this bulb right here. And in the bulb, these fibers are going to synapse with other fibers right there. Okay, so with bodies of neurons that are here, and the information will be given to these bodies, these neurons, and the axons of these neurons will continue on towards the brain, the part of the brain that's in charge of receiving olfactory information. Let's look at what this nerve looks like from a model of the brain. So this right here is the olfactory bulbs. And so here are the bodies of neurons receiving the information from the nasal cavity. And then the axons of these neurons travel through the olfactory tract. Right here, this is the olfactory bulb, towards the towards the thalamus, and from the thalamus, the information will be taken to the auditory cortex. But this is the olfactory nerve right there. Olfactory nerve is a sensory nerve. So olfactory, sensory only, no motor function. So that is cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. And like the name implies, this is going to be a nerve that's going to be coming from the eyes. And it's going to be taking visual information from the retina of the eye towards the visual cortex of the cerebrum in the occipital lobe. So let's go see where this is located. Go down here. Okay, so this is the eyeball, and this nerve is going to leave the eyeball. That will be the optic nerve. And when it gets to the area of the brain right in front of the pituitary, the fibers are going to switch from one side to another. They're going to decussate, making this X-shaped structure, which is called the optic chiasm. Chiasm means X. And then the optic tracts are going to take the information to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, where they're going to synapse with the next set of neurons. So there's the optic tract, there's the optic chiasm, there's the optic nerve itself. So you should be able to identify these structures from a model from lab. For lecture, you need to know that the optic nerve is sensory. It brings visual information to the brain. In this particular case, and as it will be in the case of models of the brain that we're going to see in the lab portion of the material, the optic nerve has been cut. Otherwise, we could not see the olfactory nerve. So it's been cut right here and right here. The eyeballs will be right there. Okay. So you need to know that these are the cut optic nerve. This is the chiasm right here, and what proceeds from the chiasm is the optic tract. Okay. So that's cranial nerve number 2. Cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor nerve, and the name is telling you a lot of what it does. It's oculo, meaning it has something to do with the eye. It's motor, which means it has something to do with movement of the eyes. So that refers to the movement of the eyeballs. This nerve has a lot of functions. We're going to see some of the functions now. We're going to see some of the functions on chapter 16. It is a motor nerve, so it has an exclusive motor function. So the first 2 are sensory. This is the first motor nerve we've encountered out of the cranial nerves. Okay. The function of this nerve, let me go ahead and give you here a depiction of it. Okay. Give me a second, I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Okay, let's see. So, function. Let's see. Several functions. Here's the nerve right here. And then what it does, it has a somatic motor function. Somatic motor means it's going to go to skeletal muscles. The skeletal muscles we're referring to are going to be the extraocular eye muscles, which there were 6 of them. And the oculomotor nerve is going to take care of 4 of the 6. And you do have to know this. Takes care of the superior rectus, the inferior rectus, the medial rectus, and the inferior oblique. So you have to know the muscles that this nerve innervates. Medial rectus, superior rectus, inferior oblique, inferior rectus. Okay, so that is the somatic motor function. It also has a visceral motor function, meaning that it's not going to innervate smooth muscles. The nerve is going to pierce the eyeball, go inside the eyeball, and innervate the muscles that control the pupil of the eye. So it's going to innervate the pupillary constrictor muscle, which is going to make the pupils constrict, make them smaller. And it also innervates it's called the ciliary muscle, and you don't necessarily need to know these. The pupillary constrictor is going to appear again next chapter, but ciliary muscle probably won't. Ciliary muscle won't appear until next semester. Is the muscle that is going to focus the eyeball, the muscle that focuses the lens of the eyeball. Because these are visceral motor functions. All right, so what do you need to know? Oculomotor nerve is a motor nerve. It's a parasympathetic nerve, meaning that it's going to be activated when we are under a parasympathetic rest and relaxation state. Reading, for example, is a parasympathetic state. So when we read, our pupils constrict because this is the nerve that innervates the pupillary constrictor. We control the lens for close vision. So again, reading, close vision, pupillary constriction is all functions of this nerve, and it is all under parasympathetic control. The other part remembers that this is the nerve that controls 4 of the 6 extraocular or extrinsic eye muscles. You should know which muscles are controlled by this nerve. And the muscles will be superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and inferior oblique. So oculomotor, where is it? Right here. Oh yeah, oculomotor nerve, not sensory, it's motor, and yes, is the first parasympathetic nerve we encounter. As far as its location, this was the olfactory, which is number 1. Optic, which is number 2, is right here. Number 3 within this line is this one right here. That's oculomotor, those 2 little nerves right there, which will be right at the mesencephalon. Number 4 is trochlear, and actually this one is an easy one to remember because it only has one function. So trochlear has no sensory function, it only has a motor function. It's not a PNS nerve. It does only one thing. It's going to control the superior oblique muscle of the eyeball. So trochlear nerve is motor, innervates the superior oblique muscle. So it directs the eyeball, the movement of the eyeball. That puts us, into the next nerve, which is the trigeminal nerve. So this is number 5. The name is trigeminal. Tri means 3, gemina means twins. So these are 3 nerves. So the trigeminal, it starts out as one nerve, which is going to synapse at a ganglia called the trigeminal nerve ganglia. And from there, it's going to come out of the ganglia as 3 nerves. It's going to have one ophthalmic branch, a maxillary branch, and a mandibular branch. This is the first mixed nerve of the 12 cranial nerves. Again, it has an ophthalmic branch, maxillary branch, mandibular branch. It is a mixed nerve because it's going to serve muscles in the face, but it's also going to bring in sensory information from teeth, gums, upper jaw, from the cornea of the eye, from lacrimal glands. Okay. Also in the mandible, it innervates the muscles of mastication. So that's a motor function. So it has sensory and motor functions. It is a mixed nerve. Its location, it's right on the pons. This is the largest nerve in the body, the largest cranial nerve, I should say, right there, the trigeminal nerve. So we had olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal. Trigeminal, it is sensory, it is motor, meaning it is mixed, and no, it is not part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you go through the extraocular eye muscles, the oculomotor took care of the superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, inferior oblique. The trochlear took care of the superior oblique. That takes care of 5 of the 6. We have one missing, which is the lateral rectus. The abducens takes care of the lateral rectus muscle. Its function is motor, does not have a sensory function. All it does is it innervates the lateral rectus muscle. Its location didn't mean to do that. Okay, so olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, right here is the abducens, cranial nerve number 6, located at the medial and inferior aspect of the pons, right there. Okay. Its function is motor. Abducens, motor function. so that's 6. We're halfway there. 7. 7 is called facial, and facial is a mixed nerve. So it has sensory, motor functions, and it is a parasympathetic nerve. So we've had oculomotor as parasympathetic. Next one is facial, which is also parasympathetic. And so it, okay, there we go, facial. It's a mixed nerve, so it has a motor function and a sensory function. The sensory function involves in taste from 2/3 of the tongue, gustatory information. Motor function is both somatic motor and visceral motor. Somatic motor is because it is called facial. It is involved in innervating the muscles of facial expression. The parasympathetic motor function has to do with innervating the lacrimal gland and the salivary glands. So when we cry or when we salivate during digestion or eating, that is a parasympathetic autonomic function. This nerve actually branches into 5 different branches right there. Innervates most of the skeletal muscles that have to do with facial expression. Bell's palsy, which is a temporary paralysis of some of these facial muscles, is a condition of cranial nerve number 5. Oh, that's 7, not 5, which is facial nerve. This should be 7. That's wrong. We're on cranial nerve number 7. Okay. All right. Let's look at it from the picture of the brain right here. Okay, so we had olfactory nerve, optic, olfactory sensory, optic sensory, oculomotor, which is motor, trochlear, which is motor, trigeminal, which is mixed, abducens, which is motor. Now, the next 2 are going to be in order. So if this is number 6, abducens right here, next to 6 is going to be 7. So this is number 7. So let me go ahead and clean this up a little bit so we can see it better. Okay, so these 2 right here is number 6. The next one here is number 7, adjacent to 6. So number 8 is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. It is a sensory nerve. It has a small motor function, which we're going to ignore. So it is in charge of hearing. This is the vestibulocochlear nerve, which are bringing sensory information from the inner ear. Let's go for the location first. We're up here already. Remember 6. Next to 6 is 7. Next to 7 is 8. Right there. Okay. So we're going in order. Number 8. And the function of 8 is to bring auditory and equilibrium information from the inner ear onto the brain. So here's the inner ear right there. And this is balance information. This is auditory information. It exits the inner ear via the internal acoustic meatus. And from there, it travels towards the brain and goes in right in the medulla at the base of the pons. So this is a sensory nerve. Cranial nerve number 9. It's actually a very important nerve. We don't spend too much time on it this time, but next semester we'll come back to this nerve over and over again. It is a large nerve. It does have a mixed function. Glottal means tongue. Pharyngeal, pharynx is the throat. So if nothing else, this muscle is going to have a motor function because it's going to innervate muscles of the tongue and the throat. Innervates the throat, pharynx muscles for swallowing. Oftentimes the gag reflex, the cough reflex travels through this nerve. Innervates part of the tongue, that's the motor function. It is a parasympathetic nerve. So in this case, the autonomic motor function will be going to the salivary gland, specifically the parotid salivary gland, which is the largest of the salivary glands. Sensory function, it conducts taste information, and then it conducts also sensory information from interoreceptors in the carotid and from the carotid artery. And this is the piece of the nerve that's going to come back next semester over and over again. All right, so we had so far 2 nerves that brought into the brain taste information, and the first one was cranial nerve number 7, facial. The second one is glossopharyngeal, number 9. So this is showing you where the cranial nerve number 9 is going to innervate muscles of the tongue, innervate muscles of the throat, innervates the parotid salivary gland, brings sensory information from the receptors in the carotid artery. So let's find it in the picture of the brain. So just to review, remember this is the olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens 6, 7, next to abducens is facial, 8, next to facial is glossopharyngeal. Oh, sorry, 8. Vestibulocochlear, sorry, 8. Number 9 down here. This is number 9, which is glossopharyngeal, right there on either side. Which means that number 10 will be right below it. That's number 10, which is the vagus nerve. Let's go back here. Again, olfactory is sensory, optic is sensory, oculomotor is motor, trochlear is motor, trigeminal is mixed, abducens is motor, facial is mixed, vestibulocochlear is mixed. Sorry, what am I saying? Vestibulocochlear is sensory. I keep messing up. Vestibulocochlear, that's number 8. Auditory information and balance information, that's sensory. Glossopharyngeal is the next one. Glossopharyngeal, facial, and oculomotor are parasympathetic nerves. We have one more parasympathetic that we need to mention. So we're on number 9. 10 is the longest of the cranial nerves. Its name is vagus. Where is it? Right here. Okay. This is the longest of the cranial nerves, and this is why. All of the other cranial nerves do not travel any further than the neck or maybe even the shoulders at the most. So they all stay within the head area. Couple go into the neck or into the shoulders. But for the most part, they all stay in the neck area, in the head area, I should say. Vagus is the exception. Vagus is going to travel all the way into the body cavities, into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, and it's going to innervate organs within those cavities. So it is the only cranial nerve that extends beyond the head and the neck regions. It is a parasympathetic nerve. It helps regulate the activities of organs in the abdominal pelvic area and the thoracic area, heart, lungs, and all of the abdominal viscera. So this is the motor function of the nerve. And you can see here how the nerve travels all the way down to the heart and the lungs and the stomach and spleen and kidneys and intestines and liver. Okay, so it has a profound effect on organs of the body. Sensory, this is a mixed nerve. So the sensory part of the nerve is bringing in sensory information from taste buds on the posterior aspect of the tongue and the pharynx. So now we have 3 nerves that are in charge of bringing taste information. Number 7, facial. Number 9, glossopharyngeal. Number 10, vagus. It also brings in sensory information from interoreceptors in the aortic artery, in the abdominal area, thoracic area, etc. It is a very, very important nerve. So let's go back to the picture of the brain and find cranial nerve number 10, vagus nerve. So this is olfactory number 1, optic number 2, oculomotor number 3, trochlear number 4, trigeminal number 5, abducens number 6, facial number 7, vestibulocochlear number 8, glossopharyngeal number 9, below glossopharyngeal, vagus number 10. The word vagus means vagabond because it is like a vagabond that wanders off to other parts of the body, not just the head. And then here from the chart, here is number 10, vagus nerve. It is a mixed nerve and it is a parasympathetic nerve. So here are the 4 parasympathetic nerves: vagus, glossopharyngeal, which is number 9, facial, which is number 7, and oculomotor, which is number 3. You should know those 4 are parasympathetic cranial nerves. We have 2 left. The 2 left are both going to be motor. So notice that we start with 2 sensory, we end with 2 motors. Accessory nerve, it is motor, and it is going to innervate muscles of the neck and the shoulders. Accessory nerve is actually a collection of nerves. Some of them are considered spinal nerves. So you can see all of these little roots right there are part of the accessory nerve number 11. It's going to go out and innervate the sternocleidomastoid, trapezius muscles. Okay. Some of the roots emerge from the actual spinal cord. So this is a nerve that's kind of in between of being a spinal nerve and a cranial nerve. The last one is number 12, which is hypoglossal. This is a motor nerve, exclusively motor. Hypo means below, glosso means tongue. So this is a nerve that is going to innervate the muscles of the tongue. You can see here, going out and innervating tongue muscles. So let me go back to the picture and identify all 12 cranial nerves. So this right here will be the olfactory bulbs, which follow to the olfactory tracts. Optic nerve right there, which leads to the optic chiasm and the optic tracts. So that is number 2. Number 3 is the oculomotor nerves right there. Number 4 is the trochlear nerves, which are motor. So oculomotor and trochlear are motor. So we start with 2 motor. Then we have mixed, the trigeminal, motor again, abducens, number 6, mixed, number 7, facial, number 8 is vestibulocochlear, and that one is sensory, number 9, glossopharyngeal, and that's mixed, vagus, number 10, that's mixed, and then we end with 2 motors, the accessory nerve, and the hypoglossal. We go back on top of the medulla, medial aspect of the medulla, for number 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. And this chart again lists all the nerves, whether they are sensory, mixed, or motor. And it also points out which ones are parasympathetic. Okay. So that basically wraps it up for chapter 13. So all we have left is chapter 16. And I will schedule a session for chapter 16. Go ahead and turn off the recording.